At what point does a video game stop being entertainment and become something closer to literature? That question was not being asked seriously in the 1980s, when games were understood primarily as products of engineering rather than as works of creative vision. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
There is a designer who spent 4 decades asking that question with every project he produced, who built games around philosophy, cinema, and political ideas at a time when the industry was not sure those things belonged in the medium at all. Tonight, we turn to a creator whose career traces the transformation of video games from simple interactive software into a form capable of carrying complex ideas about war, identity, memory, human. The question before us is how a young man in Japan who wanted to make films ended up redefining what interactive storytelling could be.
The answer begins with a culture, a childhood, and a set of creative obsessions that Kojima carried with him long before he ever entered the games industry.
We are speaking about Hideo Kojima.
Hideo Kojima is a Japanese video game designer whose work across 4 decades helped transform the medium of video games from a primarily technical entertainment form into one capable of sustained narrative, philosophical depth, and artistic ambition.
Then let us begin with the world that formed him, and with what he wanted before he found the medium that would define his career.
Hideo Kojima was born in August 1963 in Setagaya, Tokyo, and grew up in a household where his father was frequently absent due to work, and where Kojima spent large portions of his childhood alone with books, films, and his own imagination. His father passed away when Kojima was 13, an event that deepened his relationship with solitary creative absorption. He became a voracious consumer of cinema, reading extensively about film theory, and studying the work of directors he admired. The films of directors such as John Carpenter, Stanley Kubrick, and later many others shaped his instinct for atmosphere, pacing, and the way a story's emotional impact depends on how it is told, rather than simply what it says.
So his primary education was not in games, it was in cinema and literature.
Yes, and that background is essential to understanding everything he later built. He arrived at game design not as a programmer seeking to make better software, but as a storyteller seeking a medium with greater expressive range. He studied economics at Kobe University, where he also wrote fiction and continued his deep engagement with film. After graduating, he applied to film school, but faced financial constraints, and instead pursued a position in the video game industry. In 1986, he joined Konami as a planner in their MSX home computer division, a relatively modest entry point into what was still a young and rapidly changing industry.
So he entered the industry, not as a visionary, but as a junior employee, with ideas that the medium had not yet demonstrated it could support.
Exactly, and the first significant test of whether those ideas were viable came almost immediate and under severe constraints. Kojima was assigned to work on a war-themed game for the MSX2 computer. The hardware was limited in ways that made direct-action combat difficult to implement effectively. The screen could only render a small number of moving enemies at once. Rather than treating this as a disabling limitation, Kojima reframed it as a design opportunity. If the game could not fill the screen with enemies to fight, it could instead task the player with avoiding them entirely.
So stealth as a genre was born from a hardware limitation.
Yes, and this is one of the most important and frequently misunderstood facts about the origins. The popular narrative positions stealth gameplay as a creative breakthrough driven purely by artistic intention. The historical reality is that constraint and creative reframing work together. Kojima's contribution was not simply having the idea, but recognizing that the limitation could be made into a virtue. Metal Gear was released in 1987 for the MSX2 and subsequently for the Nintendo Famicom. It cast the player as a soldier named Solid Snake, tasked with infiltrating a hostile fortress and locating a weapon of mass destruction known as Metal Gear. The game's core mechanic required the player to move through enemy territory without being detected, using the environment, timing, and available tools to remain unseen rather than to overpower opposition directly.
So the player's primary power was invisibility rather than force.
Yes, and that inversion of the standard power fantasy in action games was itself a statement about how Kojima thought. Where most game designers asked how the player could be made to feel powerful, he asked how they could be made to feel tense, exposed, and vulnerable. The game was successful enough to generate a sequel, Metal Gear 2. Alongside these projects, he developed Snatcher, released in 1988, a cyberpunk visual novel game that drew heavily on the cinema of the period, and demonstrated his interest in using games as a vehicle for science fiction storytelling with genuine thematic weight.
So even in the early years, he was not limiting himself to a single genre or a single set of ideas.
No, and that range of reference drawing from cyberpunk literature, political philosophy, film noir, and science fiction would characterize all of his subsequent work. The transformation of the series into a work of major cultural significance came with Metal Gear Solid, released in 1998 for the Sony PlayStation. The game used the new capacities of three-dimensional rendering and CD-ROM storage to create an experience that moved between extended cinematic sequences and interactive gameplay in a way that had not been attempted at that level of production before. Its story engaged with questions of genetic determinism, the ethics of nuclear deterrence, information controlled by governments and corporations, and the psychological costs of a life defined by violence.
So the game was asking questions that belonged to political philosophy and to literary fiction at the same moment it was asking the player to crawl through air vents.
Exactly, and that tension between the intellectual weight of the themes and the visceral specificity of the gameplay is precisely what made Metal Gear Solid something new. The game also contained moments of deliberate self-awareness about its own status as a game, breaking what theorists call the fourth wall, addressing the player directly, and using the mechanics of the medium itself as a narrative device. In one sequence, a boss character demonstrates the ability to read the player's memory card and comment on the games they have been playing. In another, the player is instructed to plug their controller into a different port to circumvent a psychic opponent's ability to predict their actions.
So the game used the physical hardware the player was holding as a narrative element.
Yes, and that kind of formal experimentation, using the unique properties of interactivity to create meaning that no other medium could produce, became one of the defining signatures of his work. Metal Gear Solid was commercially and critically successful, selling millions of copies and receiving extensive coverage in publications that rarely engaged with video games as a serious form. The sequels that followed through the 2000s, Metal Gear Solid 2, 3, and 4, extended and complicated the series' themes, each one adding new layers to the central questions about identity, transmission of ideology across generations, and the role of information in shaping human behavior.
So the series grew into something more like a philosophical project with each new entry.
Yes. And Metal Gear Solid 2 in particular drew significant and sometimes heated critical attention for its story, which appeared to predict concerns about digital information overload, the manipulation of public perception through controlled media, and the erosion of authentic individual thought, all of which would feel increasingly relevant in the years following its release.
So some of what he was writing at the turn of the millennium reads differently from the vantage point of 2 decades later.
Yes, and that temporal quality, where his work seems to anticipate cultural anxieties before they fully surface, is one of the characteristics his most committed readers and critics point to most consistently. But the trajectory of his career within Konami was not without friction. Kojima held a distinctive position within an organization that was, like most large game publishers, primarily oriented toward commercial outcomes and franchise management. His projects were expensive, production-intensive, and frequently delayed. They were also commercially successful, which gave him unusual leverage within the company. But leverage within a corporate structure is not the same as creative freedom.
So there was a permanent tension between what he wanted to make and what a large company needed to reduce.
Yes, and this tension became public and irresolvable in 2015. When Kojima was separated from Konami under circumstances that were not fully explained by either party, but which generated substantial discussion within the industry. The departure came during the final stages of production on Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, a large and ambitious project that had been in development for several years. The separation meant that Kojima was absent from the public launch of a game he had spent years creating. He had also been involved in the early stages of a horror game project in collaboration with the film director Guillermo del Toro, which was cancelled when the relationship with Konami ended.
So the departure removed him from 2 projects at once, one that was nearly complete and one that had barely begun.
Yes, and the response from the broader game-playing community was notably strong. Kojima had become a figure who commanded public loyalty in a way that very few individuals within the industry had achieved. This is itself significant. Within a medium where the product is typically the object of attention and the creator remains largely invisible to the audience, Kojima had made himself recognizable as an individual voice with a consistent sensibility.
So he had achieved something unusual in an industry that does not typically produce names the public recognizes.
Yes, The concept of the auteur, borrowed from film criticism to describe a director whose personal vision pervades their work regardless of the industrial context in which it is produced, applies to Kojima in a way it genuinely does not apply to most game designers. His games are immediately identifiable by their approach to pacing, their density of cultural reference, their use of long cinematic sequences to develop character and theme, and their tendency to embed moments of formal experiment within otherwise conventional structures. After the separation from Konami, he founded Kojima Productions as an independent studio, entering a partnership with Sony Interactive Entertainment that gave him financial backing and platform support, while preserving creative autonomy.
So independence was not simply the end of a conflict.
Exactly. The first project from Kojima Productions was Death Stranding, released in 2019, which represented a deliberate departure from the action-oriented conventions of his earlier work. Death Stranding cast the player as a delivery courier, navigating a desolated and hostile landscape, with the central gameplay loop built around the mundane acts of crossing terrain, while managing the physical difficulty of carrying cargo. Combat existed in the game, but was not its center. The emotional core of the experience was isolation, endurance, and the gradual construction of connection between separated communities.
So, after decades of games about infiltration and conflict, the first independent project was a game about walking and reconnection.
Yes, and the critical response illustrated exactly the divide that his work tends to create. Some critics found it slow, repetitive, and self-indulgent. Others described it as the most genuinely original game design of its decade. That split is itself revealing. A work that generates such polarized responses is almost always doing something genuinely new, something that does not fit comfortably within existing evaluative frameworks.
So, the controversy around Death Stranding was a kind of confirmation that the experiment had been real.
Yes, a work that everyone agrees about has usually stayed safely within what was already understood.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand how Kojima thought about his work and what shaped his creative vision, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Big Boss, The Life and Work of Hideo Kojima, by Semyon Kostin.
So this is a work that follows Kojima from his earliest cinematic influences through to his significance within the broader history of the medium.
Precisely. Kostin traces Kojima's early fascination with cinema and storytelling, his entry into the games industry in the 1980s, and his rise as one of the most distinctive creators in interactive media. The study examines projects including Metal Gear, Snatcher, and Policenauts to show how Kojima combines cinematic technique with experimental gameplay, placing his work within the broader evolution of the industry and its growing artistic ambitions.
Is it accessible to someone who is not deeply familiar with the history of video games?
It is written to be understood without specialist knowledge of the medium. Kostin provides context for each project and explains the significance of Kojima's choices in terms that connect to broader questions about narrative and design. It is a useful entry point, both for those who know his games well and for those approaching his work for the first time through an interest in the history of storytelling.
So reading it gives a reader both the creative biography and the wider argument about what his work contributed to the medium.
Yes, and it leaves you with a clearer sense of why the question of whether games can be art is answered, quietly but definitively, by what he spent his career making.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The legacy of Kojima's work operates across several dimensions, and each one deserves careful examination. The most direct is the influence on game design itself. The stealth genre he helped to define became one of the most durable categories in the medium, generating dozens of major titles from other studios that drew on the core logic Metal Gear had established. The use of cinematic presentation, extended narrative sequences, and complex character development that Metal Gear Solid demonstrated became normalized in large-scale game production through the 2000s and 2010s, as the industry increasingly positioned itself as a narrative medium comparable in ambition to film.
So what felt experimental in 1998 became standard practice within a decade.
Yes, and the diffusion of an innovation into convention is itself a measure of its influence. The approaches that seem bold in their moment become the baseline others build from. But there are legitimate critiques of his legacy that should be held alongside the admiration. His games are frequently criticized for the length and density of their cinematic sequences, which can overwhelm the interactive elements and push the experience closer to passive viewing than active participation. Critics have argued that in borrowing so heavily from film language, His work sometimes subordinates the specific possibilities of interactivity to the conventions of a different medium, producing experiences that would, in some cases, have functioned as well or better as films.
So, the very thing that made him distinctive also defines the limits of the argument his work makes for games as a form.
Yes, that tension is real and unresolved. His defenders would argue that the interplay between cinematic and interactive moments is itself the point, that the contrast between passivity and agency generates meaning that neither alone could produce. His critics would argue that this is a justification for indulgence rather than a coherent formal strategy. Both positions have genuine evidence behind them, and the debate they represent is one of the most productive in contemporary game criticism. On a broader cultural level, Kojima's career is significant for what it demonstrates about the relationship between individual creative vision and industrial structure. The video game industry, by the late 20th century, had become one of the largest entertainment industries in the world, organized around enormous development budgets, global distribution networks, and the commercial imperatives that attend any enterprise of that scale. Within that structure, the persistence of a recognizable individual voice across decades of work is genuinely unusual. It requires a combination of commercial success, sufficient to justify the investment, and personal stubbornness, sufficient to resist the homogenizing pressure of industrial production.
So his career is also a case study in how creative identity survives contact with large institutions.
Yes. The broader question his career opens is one that the medium is still working through. What does it mean for a form defined by interactivity to develop its own tradition of authorship, its own canon of works recognized not simply as products, but as artistic statements? Video games are now routinely discussed in terms that would have been considered excessive or pretentious in the 1980s. Academic programs study them. Museums collect and exhibit them. Critics apply to them the full range of analytical tools developed for literature and film.
So the cultural legitimacy that the medium has accumulated is in part a consequence of what designers like Kojima demonstrated was possible.
Yes, he did not argue for games as art in manifestos or theoretical statements. He argued for it by making things that demanded to be taken seriously on those terms. Today, as the games industry continues to expand and as new technologies including virtual reality, procedural generation and artificial intelligence reshape what interactive experiences can be, the questions Kojima has spent his career asking remain open and increasingly urgent. What can interactivity express that passivity cannot? What is the relationship between the player's agency and the designer's intention? And what does it mean to tell a story that the audience completes through their own choices?
So the questions his career raises are not historical curiosities. They are the questions the medium is still trying to answer.
Exactly, and that is the surest sign that a creator has genuinely mattered. Not that they resolved the questions of their time, but that they formulated the questions clearly enough that the next generation could continue asking them.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the life, the work, and the lasting questions of Hideo Kojima.
He began by making a virtue of limitation, and ended by redefining what the medium was allowed to attempt.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time.